In the spring of 1944, on the wide, dusty airfields of southern Italy, the crews of the 15th Air Force climbed into their B-17 Flying Fortress bombers, expecting another long and bruising mission against targets deep inside German-held territory. Most of them had flown dozens of sorties already. They knew the routine. Take off from Foggia, form up over the Adriatic, climb to 20,000 feet, and hope the flak over the Alps did not tear them apart. What they did not expect was the small wooden crate waiting in the briefing room that morning, or the quiet excitement on the faces of the ordnance officers. Inside the crate lay a single weapon that looked at first like an ordinary 1,000-pound bomb, except for the strange tail assembly bolted to its end. 4 flat fins extended outward like the vanes of a windmill, and near the rear was a small antenna designed to catch signals in midair. The officers called it Azon, short for azimuth only. The crews stared at it without understanding. Then the briefing major held up something no bombardier had ever seen, a small metal joystick connected to a radio transmitter. His voice was calm as he explained that for the first time in the history of aerial warfare, an American bombardier could steer a bomb while it fell. The room erupted in disbelief. For years, the men of the Flying Fortresses had lived with the same frustration. They could drop hundreds of high-explosive bombs on a rail yard and still miss the one bridge that mattered. They could aim at a viaduct and hit only the hillside around it. They could level whole city blocks, yet fail to destroy a single narrow span of stone. Bombs fell straight. That was the first rule of gravity, and every man in the room had accepted it as fact. Until that morning. One bombardier, a veteran of missions over Ploesti, whispered that it sounded like magic. Another joked that the next thing the engineers would do was teach bombs how to fly back home. But their laughter faded when the major explained what Azon could do. The bomb would drop normally at first, but once it cleared the bomb bay, the bombardier would flip a switch, activating the radio receiver in the tail unit. From that moment, the bomb would listen for commands: move left, move right, hold center. It was not a smart bomb, not yet. It could not track a target or adjust its height. It could only shift sideways, responding to radio pulses sent from the aircraft above. But that ability alone changed everything. The bombardier would no longer be a man hoping his aim was perfect. He would become a pilot, steering a falling weapon through the air. The briefing shifted to their first mission. The target was a bridge the Luftwaffe had repaired repeatedly, one that had survived thousands of pounds of ordinary bombs simply because none had struck its narrow spine. Dozens of crews had tried. All had failed. Azon was built for this moment. After the briefing, the men walked toward their B-17s. The sun was rising behind Mount Vesuvius, casting long shadows across the hard-packed earth. The ground crews worked quickly, bolting the strange finned bombs to the racks under the wings. Some of the younger airmen ran their hands along the tail assembly, feeling the smooth edges of the fins as if touching the future. The bombardiers climbed into the noses of their fortresses, taking their usual seats behind the glass viewports of the Norden bombsight. But today something felt different. Instead of relying only on the Norden gyros and the drift corrections and the endless calculations of airspeed and altitude, they would hold a joystick in their right hand, a joystick meant for war. When the engines thundered to life and the aircraft began rolling down the runway, the bombardier in the lead bomber whispered to himself that he was about to guide a bomb with his own hand. The concept still felt unreal. For decades, bombs had obeyed only gravity. Now they would obey him. Over the Adriatic, the formation grew into a tight combat box. Sunlight flashed across the wings. The air grew thin and cold as the bombers climbed. When the Alps appeared ahead, jagged and white against the horizon, the crews tightened their oxygen masks and prepared for the moment the mission would shift from routine to experimental. As they crossed into enemy territory, the flak guns opened fire. Black puffs erupted around the formation, shaking the planes with violent bursts. Yet amid the chaos, the bombardiers stayed focused. They opened the bomb bay doors, letting the slipstream roar through the fuselage. The mission had become more than just another strike. It had become a test of possibility. When the target finally appeared in the bombsight, a thin line of stone cutting across a narrow valley, the lead bombardier steadied his breathing. He flipped the arming switches. He tightened his grip on the joystick. And then he pressed the release. The Azon slipped free, falling cleanly into the sunlight. At first, it behaved like every bomb he had ever released. It dropped straight down, trailing a thin silver glint. But then he nudged the joystick left. To his shock, the bomb responded. It drifted slightly, adjusting its angle. He nudged right. Again, the bomb obeyed. It was the smallest movement, barely more than a shift in its glide path, but it was real. The bombardier felt something he had never felt before, a sense of control over a weapon already in freefall. His voice cracked as he radioed the others. "It is moving! It is actually moving!" In the seconds that followed, he guided the bomb through the air, steering it like a falling arrow, aiming its descent toward the slim arch of the bridge. The rest of the crew watched through the nose blister, hardly believing what they saw. For the first time in history, a human hand was guiding a bomb in flight, not through luck, not through mathematics alone, but through direct control. And as the Azon descended toward its target, the bombardier realized that the age of unguided destruction was ending. The era of precision had just begun. The morning of the first true Azon mission began like countless others on the vast Faugia airfields. Yet every man in the bomber group felt a tension that was different from flak fear or fighter fear. This was the kind of tension that came when history was about to tilt. The crews of the B-17s walked across the dusty ground toward their aircraft while a warm wind blew across the rows of bombers glinting in the rising sun. Ground crews were already at work sliding the long-finned bombs from their carts and securing them onto the racks beneath the wings. The ordnance crews handled Azon with a strange mix of caution and pride because they knew they were loading something new, something the enemy had never seen, and something that even the Americans barely understood. The bombardiers checked their gear again and again. Each man carried not only the adjustable sight controls of the Norden bombsight, but also the new radio transmitter box and the small joystick strapped beside it. The joystick looked almost fragile next to the thick metal and riveted panels around them. Yet that little stick held the promise of guiding a bomb across miles of air. Before takeoff, the squadron commander climbed onto a jeep and shouted reminders over the engine noise. He told them to trust their training, to keep the bomb in view, to stay steady no matter how bad the flak became, and to remember that the bomb would only respond in the horizontal plane. It could not climb or dive, it could only slide left or right. That meant the bombardier had to watch carefully and adjust constantly, guiding the weapon toward the narrow target. Then the engines began rumbling one by one, shaking the ground. The propellers spun into silver discs, and the crews boarded their planes. The air inside the nose of each B-17 was cold, but the bombardiers barely noticed. Their minds were on the mission. When the formation lifted off the earth and climbed into the Italian sky, the bombers formed a layered combat box above the Adriatic. The air was clear and blue. As they approached the Alps, the sunlight flashed across snowy peaks. But the beauty of the mountains hid the danger waiting ahead. This mission was not a deep strategic raid on oil refineries or industrial centers. This time, the target was a single bridge across a narrow river gorge. Ordinary bombs had failed to hit it for months. The Germans repaired it every time it took damage because they knew Allied armies needed it destroyed. Today, Azon would be tested against a target no larger than a narrow thread of stone. As the bombers approached the northern slopes of Italy, the radio chatter quieted. Ahead lay the enemy. Flak belts. The formations tightened their spacing, noses pointed forward, engines straining for altitude. The first bursts of flak appeared in the distance, small black flowers blooming against the sky. They grew larger and thicker until the air seemed to boil with exploding metal. The bombers shook in violent bursts. Shell fragments rattled against fuselages. The crews braced themselves, gripping their oxygen masks, but the bombardiers refused to look away from their sights. They had been told that if they lost visual contact with the Azon bomb after release, it would fall unguided. They would have no second chance. After 30 minutes of climbing through the storm of flak, the valley came into view. It was narrow, steep-sided, and shadowed even in daylight. At its center was the bridge, a thin arch of stone running from one cliff to the other like a scratch made by a knife across the rock. The lead bombardier leaned over his Norden. His voice was steady as he gave corrections to the pilot. The formation drifted slightly left, then right, holding its position while the bomb bay doors opened beneath them. Cold air filled the interior. The bombardier placed his right hand on the joystick, his left hand rested on the bombsight controls. He tracked the crosshairs carefully, letting the sight settle over the midpoint of the span. The moment came in a breath. Bombs away. The Azon tumbled free and stabilized quickly. The bombardier activated the radio receiver and began guiding it with soft, deliberate movements. The bomb shone faintly in the sunlight like a falling spark. At once, the flak guns below shifted fire upward. Black clouds exploded around the bomber. The interphone filled with shouts, but the bombardier kept his eyes locked on the falling shape. He nudged the joystick right to correct for drift. The bomb responded with a smooth glide. The German gunners realized too late that something was different. This bomb was not falling straight. It was adjusting its course. The bombardier felt sweat roll beneath his mask. He continued guiding the bomb as it dropped lower and lower. Every twitch of the joystick shifted its path just enough to keep it lined up with the narrow stone bridge. The radio pulses hummed through the cockpit as the signal reached the falling weapon. A second squadron watched from behind, stunned by what they saw. The lead bombardier whispered a correction. Left, hold, right. The bomb obeyed. A flak burst directly beneath the bomber, almost lifting it. The pilot fought for stability. The bombardier kept steering, guiding the bomb as gravity snapped at it. As the weapon neared the target, the whole crew leaned forward as if willing it to strike true. For the final few seconds, the bombardier made tiny corrections, each one bringing the Azon closer to the middle of the bridge. Then the view vanished in a burst of smoke as the bomb struck. The explosion split the stone span in a shower of dust and debris. The bridge broke at its center and folded into the ravine below. The radio came alive with disbelief. They hit it! They actually hit it! The second bombardier in the trailing aircraft whispered that it looked like the bomb had its own mind. But the truth was stranger. It was the first time in the history of warfare that a man had guided a falling bomb to a pinpoint target with his own hand. As the formation turned for home, the crews felt something shift inside them. They had not just completed a mission. They had witnessed a new era begin. Azon had proved that precision bombing was no longer a dream. It was real. And this was only the beginning. The day after the first successful mission, the bombardiers of the 15th Air Force gathered in a long canvas briefing tent, while engineers from the United States Army Air Forces prepared to explain the weapon they had just used. Many of the airmen still could not believe what they had seen. They had guided a bomb with their own hands, watched it shift in the air and strike a target that months of ordinary bombing had failed to destroy. Now they wanted to know how it worked. The lead engineer placed an Azon tail assembly on the table. Without the bomb body attached, it looked almost delicate, a metal skeleton with 4 flat fins extending outward and a small radio receiver embedded in the rear. But the engineer spoke with the confidence of someone who knew he was holding the future. He explained that the Azon bomb was designed around a simple principle. Ordinary bombs dropped in a clean, predictable arc. Once released, their path could not be changed. Azon kept that arc, but added a new capability. It could shift sideways in midair. Only sideways, not up, not down, not faster or slower, just left or right. That limitation might have seemed small, but it was revolutionary. The key lay in the fins. When the bombardier moved the joystick in the B-17, the transmitter sent a radio pulse downward. The receiver in the tail interpreted the pulse and tilted one of the fins slightly. The tilt pushed the rear of the bomb in one direction, nudging the nose in the other. The bomb then drifted along a new course, carried by its own momentum and the air rushing around it. The engineer compared it to steering a falling leaf. The bomb did not turn sharply, it glided gently but predictably. That was all the bombardier needed. He did not have to force it to turn in tight arcs, he only had to correct its drift and guide it toward a narrow target. The bombardiers listened in silence as the engineer explained that the Azon system had been tested at Eglin Field in Florida. Crews had practiced over painted targets on sand. They had learned that the bomb responded best to small corrections and that the bombardier had to maintain visual contact throughout the fall. In training, they had used bright-colored fins to keep the bomb visible. In combat, they relied on sunlight and the gleam of the metallic surface. The system had worked reliably in tests. What no one knew until now was whether it would survive real flak, real turbulence, and the vibration of real battle. The mission the day before had given the answer. Azon worked. And it worked against the one kind of target that had defied conventional bombing again and again. Bridges, rail lines, locomotives, fuel cars. German forces relied on these arteries to supply the front. Destroying them with ordinary bombs was almost impossible because they were small, narrow, and often repaired within days. But with Azon, a single bomber could do what entire bomb groups had failed to accomplish. The engineer lifted the tail assembly and pointed to the antenna mounted on the rear. This, he said, was the heart of the system. Without it, Azon would fall straight. With it, the bomb became something entirely new. Not a smart bomb, not a self-guiding missile, but something in between. A weapon that listened, that responded, that followed a human will even as gravity pulled it downward. One bombardier raised his hand. He asked what would happen if multiple Azon bombs were dropped at once. Would they interfere with each other? The engineer shook his head. The system allowed only one bomb to be guided at a time. The bombardier could release several, but as soon as a second bomb activated its receiver, the pilot would have to guide that one instead. The first would continue unguided. That was why each squadron used only a handful of Azon bombs per mission. Precision required attention. Another airman asked why the bomb could only move sideways. The engineer replied that adding vertical control would require systems far too heavy for a bomber to carry. Radio control was new and still primitive. Horizontal control alone consumed a surprising amount of radio power. Vertical control would require a level of engineering that simply did not exist yet. Yet the idea stayed in the room long after the engineer stopped talking. Vertical control. Fully guided bombs. weapons that could home in on targets by themselves. The bombardiers glanced at one another, sensing a future none of them could fully imagine. After the briefing, the men followed the engineers outside to the maintenance sheds, where the next shipment of Azon tail assemblies waited in crates. The engineers demonstrated how each fin was mounted, how the internal gyroscope kept the bomb stable, and how the antennas were tested before loading. Watching the technicians move the fins by hand made the bombardiers imagine the bomb falling through the air, responding to their touch. The joystick became less a novelty and more an extension of themselves, a wand guiding destruction. In the days that followed, they practiced with wooden mock-ups. The bombardiers learned to make gentle corrections rather than sharp jerks that could send the bomb into an unpredictable tumble. They trained their eyes to track a falling object through haze, smoke, and wind. They rehearsed timing, measuring how many seconds they would have between release and impact, usually less than 30. Every bombardier knew those seconds would feel like an eternity in combat. The science behind Azon was simple enough when explained in diagrams, but nothing about it felt simple in practice. It required a calm hand under fire, a steady eye in turbulence, and the ability to ignore exploding flak as the bombers pushed through German defenses. And yet, every man who practiced with the joystick felt something growing inside him: pride, curiosity, wonder. For years, they had been told that their job was to aim perfect when gravity did the rest. Now, they were being told something different. They were no longer passive servants of physics. They were pilots guiding a weapon after it had already left the aircraft. They had rewritten a law of war. The final moment of the lesson came when the engineer closed the tail assembly and ran his hand over the fins. He told the bombardier something they would never forget. If you can guide a bomb, even a little, then the enemy will never again feel safe behind small targets. And if we can guide this bomb, imagine what we can guide next. With that sentence, the air around them seemed to shift. Azon was not just a tool, it was a doorway. And the men of the 15th Air Force had taken the first step into a new era that no one on Earth was prepared for. The next weeks became a proving ground for Azon as the bomber groups of the 15th Air Force launched mission after mission against targets that had frustrated Allied planners for more than a year. The Germans had built their logistics system on narrow vulnerabilities: bridges across mountain valleys, rail junctions tucked between steep cliffs, and single rail cars filled with fuel or ammunition that moved constantly along the Danube corridor. Ordinary bombs could damage these targets, but rarely destroy them. The blast radius was too wide, the aiming margin too unforgiving. Now, for the first time, American crews carried a weapon built specifically to attack the smallest link in the German supply chain. The first major test came against the Ora Bridge, a stone span near the Brenner Pass that served as a vital artery between Germany and Italy. The Luftwaffe had defended it fiercely, and German engineers repaired it after every attack. Allied planners knew that shutting down the Brenner line, even for a week, could cripple German reinforcement efforts in Italy. They assigned Azon to the task. At dawn, the bombers lifted from Foggia, climbing into the crisp blue sky. Engines droned in steady rhythm while the crews checked their Azon transmitters and strapped the joysticks into place. As the formation crossed the Alps, the sun glinted off their wings, creating sharp flashes of light across the snowfields below. Then the flak belts opened. The valley around Oran erupted with exploding shells. Black bursts dotted the sky like ink thrown on glass. The bombers shuddered under the impacts, yet continued forward. The lead aircraft opened its bomb bay doors as the river and the narrow bridge slid into view. The bombardier adjusted the Norden sight one last time, then released the Azon. The bomb steadied, catching the wind. the bombardier activated the control link. At once, he saw the bomb drift slightly offline. He nudged the joystick. The bomb obeyed, drifting back toward the center of the bridge. Flak burst dangerously close, but he kept his eyes on the tiny speck of falling metal. More corrections. Left. Hold. Slight right. The seconds stretched thin. At the final moment, the bomb slipped perfectly into line. The valley below erupted in a massive plume of dust as the bridge snapped in half and folded into the river. The formation roared with disbelief over the radios. They had hit the target dead center. The Aura Bridge, that had shrugged off thousands of pounds of unguided explosive, was gone in a single strike. Days later, a mission over the Danube proved that Azon was not a one-time miracle. A German train carrying ammunition and fuel was spotted moving along the river. The target was a single rail car, no wider than a farmhouse wall and nearly impossible to hit from high altitude. Yet the bomber crews attacked with confidence. When the Azon bomb fell, the bombardier guided it with deliberate movements, the specks shifting subtly against the green fields below. As it neared the train, the bombardier whispered into his microphone as if speaking to the bomb itself. A little more. A little more. Now. The explosion tore the train apart in a blast of fire and smoke, sending debris into the air like scattered embers. The rail line was severed. German troops scrambled to understand how a single bomb could cut a moving target with such precision. The next missions were even more ambitious. One operation targeted the bridge at Saint-Michel. The bridge lay between cliffs so narrow that even spotting the target from 20,000 feet was difficult. The bombardier in the lead aircraft described it later. It looked like aiming at a pencil laid across a canyon. Yet Azon made the impossible possible. 20 seconds after release, the bombardier saw the bomb drifting too far right. He corrected. The bomb shifted cleanly back toward the center of the bridge. A gust of wind pushed it left. He countered again. Back and forth, the corrections guided the weapon with a grace no unguided bomb had ever shown. When the Azon struck, the stone arch shattered, sending a column of dust skyward. In the briefing room that night, the crews replayed the moment again and again. They had done something no bomber group in Europe had done before. They had steered destruction onto a target barely wider than the wings of their aircraft. Soon, commanders realized Azon could reshape the entire strategy of the air war. Instead of flattening entire towns to destroy a rail yard, they could send a handful of B-17s armed with Azon. Instead of sending 1,000 planes to damage a key bridge, they could send a squadron. Instead of praying for good luck, they could rely on human skill. In missions over the Balkans, Azon bombs cut bridges that the Germans considered untouchable because they were protected by terrain rather than concrete. One target was a steel span crossing a deep gorge in Yugoslavia. For months, it had stood as a lifeline to German troops. The gorge made a direct hit nearly impossible until Azon arrived. The formation flew through heavy clouds, emerging just long enough for the bombardier to spot the bridge. He released the bomb knowing he would only have seconds to correct its path. He guided it through turbulence, tracked it through the shifting haze, and watched as it dropped cleanly onto the steel spine. The explosion echoed off the cliffs. The bridge fell in a twisting scream of metal. German reports later described the strike as shocking and precise beyond expectation. But perhaps the most remarkable Azon attack was the destruction of a single stalled locomotive near the Austrian border. The train had been hidden under camouflage netting, surrounded by trees. Yet an Azon bomb curved gently toward it as if drawn by intent. The blast engulfed the locomotive and lit the surrounding trees in bright flame. The bombardier who guided that strike told his crew afterward that it felt less like dropping a bomb and more like pointing at the target and commanding it to die. With each mission, word spread through the ranks. Azon was changing the war. It was not loud like napalm or overwhelming like area bombing. It was quiet, precise, disciplined. It gave a single bombardier the power to change the course of a battle with one well-guided drop. And though the world would one day remember radar bombs, laser bombs, and GPS-guided weapons, the men who flew in 1944 knew the truth. The first step toward modern precision did not begin with a satellite or a computer. It began with a joystick held in the shaking hands of a bombardier climbing through the flak-torn skies of Italy. By the end of 1944, the bomber crews of the 15th Air Force understood something that had not yet reached the newspapers back home or the desks of the generals in Washington. They had not just tested a new bomb, they had crossed a threshold in the history of warfare. Azon began as a technical experiment, but became the first true demonstration that a human hand could guide a weapon through the air toward a specific point on the Earth. For thousands of years, weapons had behaved the same way. Arrows flew in arcs. Artillery traveled along fixed trajectories. Bombs fell straight. Once released, they were governed by the laws of nature and nothing else. But Azon introduced a new rule. The laws of nature could be negotiated. A man could talk to gravity, and gravity would listen. The crews felt the weight of that change more clearly with each mission. On the long flights home, they discussed what the bomb had done, not only to bridges and trains, but to their own understanding of the sky. Before Azon, they had been passengers of physics. Now they were participants. They had watched the bomb glide when they pushed right and drift when they pushed left. They had seen narrow spans vanish under the blast of a bomb that should never have been able to hit them. Many bombardiers described the same sensation, as if the bomb were not falling on its own, but waiting for them to tell it what to do. One crewman from the second bomb group later wrote that guiding an Azon felt like steering a small piece of fate downward through the clouds. Another bombardier said it felt like pointing the finger of God. Yet for all its precision, Azon was simple. The bomb could only steer in the horizontal plane. It could not find a target by itself. It did not think, it only listened. And yet that small ability, the capacity to listen, changed everything. The missions continued into the winter. Snow fell across the Italian peaks. The skies grew gray and turbulent. Yet Azon continued hitting targets that conventional bombs could not. In the briefing rooms, the crews pinned reconnaissance photos to the walls, showing destroyed bridges and broken rail lines with narrow craters that matched the exact strike point of the guided bombs. Commanders began grouping these photos into a collection they unofficially called the Gallery of Impossibles. Targets that were considered immune to bombing were now listed as destroyed by a single Azon. The gallery included the shattered Ora Bridge, the broken curves of rail viaducts in Austria, the severed Danube train line, and the twisted remains of locomotives caught by bombs that adjusted course in the final seconds of their descent. High-level officers soon realized the implications. If a simple radio-controlled tail fin could overcome the ancient limitations of bombing, what might be possible if the technology improved? Could bombs steer vertically? Could they follow moving targets? Could they be guided not by eyesight, but by radar or light or some future sensor? Those questions were no longer fantasies, they were possibilities. The first real indication of this shift came from the engineers themselves. After studying the performance of Azon, they began drawing diagrams for a next-generation weapon, one that could control both azimuth and elevation. This new design would one day evolve into the Razon and eventually pave the way for fully guided bombs decades later. But for the crews flying over Europe in 1944, the ideas felt distant, like glimpses of a future beyond imagining. What mattered to them was something more immediate. They saw a change in how the enemy reacted. German forces began camouflaging trains in ways they had never attempted before. They started building false bridges to mislead bombardiers. They cut new diversion paths through mountain passes not because American bombs were leveling everything, but because American bombs were now too accurate to ignore. German soldiers captured after raids described the guided bombs as uncanny. They said it felt as if the bombers were aiming bullets from miles above the clouds. One prisoner described how his unit abandoned a supply bridge at night because they believed the Americans would steer a bomb directly onto it the next morning. Even if they hid it under smoke screens, they feared that the bomb would find it anyway. In the minds of the defenders, Azon was not a limited, experimental device. It was a supernatural precision weapon. The truth lay somewhere in between. It was primitive by modern standards, yet revolutionary in its moment. It required skill, patience, and courage. The bombardier guiding an Azon had to remain steady while flak tore holes in the sky. He had to ignore the shuddering fuselage, the lurching aircraft, and the distant flashes of German fire below. He had to keep his eyes fixed on a falling object smaller than a matchbox from 20,000 feet. And in those final seconds before impact, he had to make corrections so tiny and so deliberate that any mistake might send the bomb drifting harmlessly into the countryside. Many bombardiers later admitted that the hardest part was the silence. Once the bomb was released, all noise seemed to disappear, except the wind and the soft clicks of the transmitter. In that silence, they felt the weight of responsibility. They were guiding destruction with their own hand, and every correction, every twitch of the joystick became a moral choice as much as a tactical one. Yet they continued because the mission required it and because they understood what was at stake. When the war ended and the world turned its attention to reconstruction, Azon faded quietly from public memory. Larger, more advanced guided bombs would take the spotlight in the decades that followed. But historians would one day look back and recognize the truth. The first time a man steered a bomb in combat, the first time a weapon listened to human control while falling through the sky, the first time precision became possible, was over Italy in 1944. It was not lasers or satellites that opened the door to modern warfare. It was a bombardier in a freezing glass nose compartment, gripping a trembling joystick while flak blossomed around his aircraft. It was a 1,000-pound bomb shifting sideways through the air, obeying radio commands from 20,000 feet above. That moment marked the birth of guided warfare. And though Azon would be overshadowed by the systems that came after it, the men who flew those missions knew something no one else did. They had been present at the dawn of the future. They had watched the sky itself change. They had seen the first bomb that did not simply fall. It turned.